Good morning, everybody. And it's actually very nice to be back. It wasn't certain as a British MEP that I would be able to stand here for another 5 years and be able to say that I'm a member of the European Parliament and a member of Econ. But I can confirm that. And also I'm hoping that very shortly the confirmation will be formalised that I will also be the coordinator of what is now the third largest group in the Parliament, the European Conservatives and Reformists. So I have a huge job ahead of me, and I hope will be helping many of you actually find your way through the whole labyrinth of what's going to be financial regulation continued in this next mandate. Now, it's fascinating to hear Simon talk as if all of the things that are now in place in terms of regulatory dialogue have existed for a long time. I can assure you in 2009, when I came here, it wasn't the case at all. And even more fascinating is to hear Simon talk about the ambition of a global rule book. Well, in 2009, we hadn't even established or even thought of establishing the European supervisory authorities, with a common rule book being established for the EU 27 then, now EU 28 member states. So we have come a long, long way since 2009. And I have to say, I think the pace of change has been phenomenal. I think it's all down to the crisis. If there hadn't been a crisis, I'm not sure we would ever have had European supervisory authorities in place in that timescale. And we certainly, I don't think, would have had a common rule book for Europe, let alone for the rest of the world. So I think we actually have to look back and look at these 5 years as being a major change for the better. And for the global financial markets, we have to understand that actually this really has been a really good result, making sure that we have consistency in the large markets around the world. So I do think that we need to take a little caution that we have come a long way. We are still bedding in a lot of those changes, and we shouldn't actually be overly ambitious about some of the things we need to achieve in the very short term. I think we need to actually accept the changes already have been massive, and that some areas of financial regulation need some time to catch up with what's already happened. And certainly for us, we've got some big challenges on the horizon. As one of the members of the European Parliament who negotiated EMIR in the last mandate, I can tell you I am not looking forward to the review period that is already looming, even though we haven't actually had the implementation date for many of the things in EMIR from the last set of negotiations. So it's not going to be plain sailing. There are lots of things and challenges that we're going to have to rise to in the next few years. But I'm actually really encouraged by the level of regulatory dialogue that is already taking place. Wherever I go across the globe to talk about financial regulation, people now know what European regulation is about. They at least have an understanding of how it's come about, and they have an understanding not only of the shortcomings of some areas of it, but also some of the benefits and some of the consistency that we've now achieved globally. I would like to say I am a huge fan of the global institutions setting an agenda, which then actually encourages all the different regions to have a common goal and a common objective to make sure that their rules comply, at least in the outcome, even if it's not on a specific detail. And I really do actually encourage the FSB and IOSCO to make sure that they really do bring that agenda together on a global basis and continue to be at the forefront, rather than each country and region actually pushing forwards their own rules first. Because once the rules are in place, it's much more difficult to actually get people to move from their position. Whereas if you're setting the agenda, it's much better to get people to come with you. So I would actually encourage those of you who actually work for those institutions to really be at the forefront and not to take your foot off the pedal, and to really make sure that you actually push forwards. I don't want the European Parliament taking the lead on it. I really do want those of you with expertise to take the lead rather than us politicians. I'm also very encouraged, in all fairness, by some of the working groups that have been established by the regulators around the globe. And I think it's really important that those are very actively encouraged and that industry plays a very active role within that. And it's nice to see some of the investors here in the room and those of you with trade associations from the investor community. In the last 5 years, I do feel that the investors' voice has not been heard as loudly as some of the service providers. And so I would really like and encourage those voices to actually be very, very loud and active in the next mandate. I think we've also come to an acceptance in the last Parliament here and across the conversations I've had, particularly in the US, that legislation is done differently. Our authorities don't have the same level of autonomy as the authorities in the US. And I think it was fascinating to hear earlier on this week the description of we've been very creative in finding the answers to the barriers we've come across. That word creative, in some respects, is in itself creative. However, I think we need to be careful that we are within the boundaries of what was originally set within the legislative framework. And if we find that we have to change the legislation, both sides of the Atlantic, we need to make sure that we are prepared to do it. And there are still some barriers in the way, and certainly for me, there are some big barriers with regards to investor protection. And when I spent some time in the States earlier this year, to be told that actually EMIR's investor protection is going to have to be weakened in order for US clearinghouses to be accepted, that isn't acceptable. I think we need to be able to look at ways in which investor protection is at the forefront of everything that we do, wherever it is in the world. Investors' assets ultimately are investors' assets, and we need to make sure that protection of those assets is at the forefront of what we try and put in place. And so for me, there are barriers in the way, and if the US bankruptcy laws need to be changed, then I think people need to actually look at whether or not it can happen. And if it can't happen because of your federal system, then there need to be other pieces of legislation that maybe come about. And I know there are challenges within the US system. We have them here. And we have a new parliament. So there are challenges on both sides, and the challenge of the new parliament is one I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about. The parliament, over half the members have changed. We are a significantly different body to the one that was here in the last 5 years. The membership is very different, the balance of power is very different, and there's going to be much more of the grand coalition-style politics coming out. We've already seen it in the last week here. We've seen all sorts of deals done between the two large parties. We've seen all sorts of backroom politics taking place. And I think that is going to be a serious message of the next parliament, is that this will be much more consensual. It's going to be much more having to get everybody to agree around the table. Financial services last time round benefited from a centre-right majority, and often on specific issues within legislation, we actually took the view that the centre-right majority was sufficient to actually take through certain parts of the legislation. That certainly was the case within the MiFIR/MiFID pieces of legislation, where the centre-right majority often took things through that wouldn't have got through the whole Parliament on their own merit. So we haven't got that benefit this time round. So these negotiations are going to be tougher. And I think there are going to be some things at the heart of this that we have to recognise will be different. However, I do think you need to do a lot of messaging within the Parliament. The learning curve will be steep for those new members. The Econ Committee has got a large number of new members. Those of us who've been there for 5 years will try and encourage people to get involved. We'll try and encourage people to meet with as many of you as possible to make sure they have a broad base of knowledge from which to work. But so will everybody else be getting to them. And so you need to make sure your messaging is clear and consistent, because 2009, I can tell you, the messaging was not consistent. And so I think we need to actually make sure that we have got that message out there. But as well as a new parliament, you're going to have a new commission. So come the autumn, I think we're going to have a huge amount of work to do to understand where the new commissioner in this field of financial regulation is going to want to go in terms of priorities. And of course, I have already mentioned the specific pieces of legislation we're going to have to be very aware of as a group, from both within the Parliament and industry, and those of you who are actually on the other side of the Atlantic doing regulation. The review of EMIR will be a large piece of work, but level 2 of MiFID/MiFIR is also a huge focus for me and for others who worked on that dossier in the last Parliament. And even though I know we're not supposed to be talking about TTIP, a word of caution. TTIP negotiations will spill over into financial services, regulatory thoughts and consequences within the Parliament. And from what I'm hearing in my first few weeks here, TTIP doesn't have universal acceptance amongst the parliamentarians. There is a large growing group of anti-TTIP rhetoric going on in the Parliament. So I think people need to understand what TTIP is about. need to understand where financial services dialogue is currently and the big leaps we've made in that transatlantic dialogue. And I think we need to actually start really getting to the bottom of where the issues are on TTIP and where people's concerns are so that we can get to the bottom of it. Data is going to be an enormous thing that the Parliament's dealing with. It will be dealt with across many committees because this isn't just financial services data. This is data of any kind. It's all sorts of protection issues in terms of personal data. They are going to be at the heart of many of the negotiations. And so I would just err on the side of caution. The Parliament needs to be brought up a learning curve. You can all help, but please be consistent in your messaging. And I think the regulatory dialogue, transatlantic, will thrive if we can get all those new members on board. I'm going to leave it there, and I think the panel will give us a chance to get lots of questions afterwards.